I stood at the foot of the king's own table with a ledger in my hands instead of a tray, and I read the tally out loud to a hall that had gone the particular quiet of people who have just understood they are about to be caught at something. 61, I said. 61 recorded instances of laughter at this table in the last year, my lords. Every one of them entered by Lord Kessler's own clerk, with a mark beside each name for who laughed and who did not. I turned a page, and 44 of the 61 fall within 3 days of a council vote. I would like this hall to explain to me why the king's own jokes are funniest in the week before his lords are asked to agree with him. Nobody explained it. Nobody has ever been able to explain it, because there was no explanation that did not end with a man losing his office. 11 weeks earlier, I had laughed at the wrong man's joke at the royal feast, and the whole hall had gone still enough to hear it. My name is Liv, and I carried trays at Grimhold Keep, which is not a post anybody remembers a person for, and I had held it for 2 years without once being looked at twice. I was 23 that autumn, no house behind my name, my father a fisherman on the grey coast, who had 4 daughters and needed 1 fewer mouth. And I had come up to Grimhold at 17 and learnt the trade, the way you learn any trade that consists mostly of being invisible, in the correct places, at the correct times. I was good at it. I want that understood before anything else, because everyone who tells this story afterward makes it sound as though I stumbled into the Great Hall by accident, and I did not. I had served at 40 state feasts by the time this one happened, and I could carry a full tray down that hall blindfolded, and I knew that hall better than most of the lords who sat in it. What I did not know, in 2 years of serving it, was that every single laugh in it was a lie. I want to explain the feast nights at Grimhold, because you have to understand the shape of the room before you understand what I did in it. King Axel held a formal table twice a month, the ranked houses, the council, 40 places, a great deal of ceremony, and considerably less food than the ceremony implied. And somewhere in every single one of those evenings, the king would say something. Dry, mostly, understated, the kind of thing a tired man says, because the alternative is saying nothing at all for 3 hours. And the whole table would laugh. Every time, instantly, and together, and at exactly the same pitch, 40 ranked men and women producing the identical sound within a half second of each other. And I had carried trays through that laughter for 2 years, and never once thought about it. Because a laugh is a laugh, and I had a tray to get to the far table. I thought about it that night because of where I was standing. I was behind Lord Kessler's chair, refilling his cup, when the king said the thing that started this. It was not even a good joke. It was a small, tired, self-deprecating remark about his own handwriting, something about how his own steward could not read his signature, and neither, most days, could he, said quietly. Mostly to himself, to the man beside him. Not projected, the way you project a jest you want the whole hall to catch. And I laughed. I want to be honest about why. It was funny, in the specific dry way that catches you when you are not braced for it. And I had a tray in my hands, and I was 3 feet from him, and I simply laughed. The way you do. Out loud. Before I had thought about whether I was allowed to. I was the only one. I understood it about a half second after it happened. The way you understand any mistake. The whole hall's laughter had already come and gone, a beat before mine, on cue, together. And mine arrived alone, and late, and real, and it hung in that hall by itself, for a moment that felt considerably longer than a moment actually is. King Axel turned and looked at me. I did not put the tray down. I want that on the record, because I have been asked 100 times whether I dropped it, whether I fled, whether I did any of the dramatic things the story has since acquired. I stood there holding a tray of empty cups with my whole face burning, and the King of Grimhold looked at a servant 3 feet from his shoulder, for what felt like a very long time. And then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, that's the first one of those all year. He did not stop looking at me for the rest of the night. I want to be precise about what that means, because it does not mean what the court decided it meant. He did not stare. He did not single me out again, did not speak to me, did not do a single thing that a hall full of 40 ranked people could have pointed to. But every time I came within his sightline for the rest of that feast, his eyes found me before they found the tray, and by the time the hall emptied, I understood that I had done something considerably larger than laugh at a joke, and I had no idea what. I found out 4 days later, when Lord Bjark, the king's second, came down to the kitchens himself, which a king's second does not do, and asked for the tray girl who had laughed. I thought I was being dismissed. I want that understood, because it shaped everything I said to him for the first quarter of an hour. I had spent 4 days convinced I had committed some enormous breach of protocol, and I stood in that kitchen corridor bracing for it, and Bjark, a broad, grey, unhurried man, looked at me for a long moment and said something I did not expect at all. How long have you served the formal table? 2 years, my lord. And in 2 years, how many times have you heard a genuine laugh at it? Before last week. I had to think about that. And the thinking itself told me something. None, I said slowly. I've never thought about it before, my lord. But no. None that I can remember. Bjarke nodded like a man confirming something he had already suspected and hoped he was wrong about. His Grace would like to speak with you, he said. You are not in trouble. I want you to hear that from me before you hear anything else, because I watched your face just now and I know exactly what you were bracing for. King Axel received me in a small room off the council chamber, and he did not sit behind a table, which I noticed because every account I had ever heard of an audience with a king involved a table between the king and the person he was receiving. I am not going to pretend this is ordinary, he said. You laughed at something I said, and it was the first time in longer than I can properly account for that I have heard a sound in that hall I did not already know was coming before I opened my mouth. I'm sorry, Your Grace, I didn't mean to. Do not apologize for it. I would like you to do it again, as often as you find something actually funny, and I would like you to understand that this is possibly the strangest request I have ever made of anyone, including men I have sent to war. He was quiet a moment. Do you know what it is to say something to a room and have the room agree with you before you have finished deciding whether you meant it as a joke? I did not, and I said so. It is the loneliest thing I have ever experienced, said the King of Grimhold, and I have experienced a great many lonely things. I say something. The room laughs. It laughs at the same instant every time at the same pitch, whether the thing I said was actually amusing, or whether I simply cleared my throat oddly. I have begun, over the last year, to test it. Small things, said flatly, not funny at all, and the room laughs at those exactly as readily as it laughs at the ones I meant to be funny. Do you understand what that tells a man? It tells him that nothing he says is actually being heard. It is simply being answered. I did not know what to say to that. So I said the true thing, which has always been my only reliable instinct. That sounds unbearable, Your Grace. It is unbearable, he said, and until last week I did not know there was an alternative in the building. The days after that fell into a shape I could not have predicted, and would not have believed if you had described it to me in advance. He sent for me. Not often, not grandly, but 2 or 3 times a week, in the evening, to that same small room, and we talked, and I want to be honest about what those conversations actually were, because the version people tell now has a great deal more romance in the early weeks than there actually was. Mostly he asked me questions, and genuinely wanted the answers. What the kitchens thought of the winter stores, whether the servants' hall found the new steward fair, what it was actually like on the Grey Coast, which he had never visited and had, I gathered, always wanted to. He asked about my father and my 3 sisters and the boats, and he listened the way a man listens when he has spent a year being answered instead of heard and has only just noticed the difference. And he told me things too. Not state business, the ordinary weight of a man who rules alone, whose own counsel laughs on cue, whose own dinner table has apparently not produced one honest reaction to him in longer than he can measure. He told me he had begun to doubt his own sense of humour entirely, because he had no way left to test it. He told me, once, that he had started saying deliberately unfunny things at dinner, just to see whether anyone would fail to laugh, and that no one ever had, and that this had frightened him considerably more than it would have frightened most men. I want to describe one particular evening, because it is the one I go back to when people ask me when I actually fell for him, as though there were a single moment, as though it were not simply a great many small evenings adding up the way a tide comes in. It was the 7th week, and I had brought no tray and no purpose, except the one he had given me, and I found him at that small table with a stack of petitions he had clearly been failing to read for some time. He looked up when I came in and said, without any preamble at all, "Tell me something true that has nothing to do with me." "That's a strange request, Your Grace." "It is the only request I have left that I trust," he said. "Everything else in my life is either about me or performed for me, and I would like, once a week if I can manage it, to hear about something that is neither." So I told him about my sister Ronja, who had married a boat builder on the Grey Coast that summer, and who wrote to me in a hand so bad I had to read her letters twice, and about a dispute she was having with her new mother-in-law over the proper way to salt fish, which had apparently become a matter of real and ongoing household warfare. I told him about the boat builder's dog, who had taken the mother-in-law's side entirely, and now would not be in a room with my sister. He laughed at that. Properly, the same sound I had heard the first night, low and a little rusty, like a thing that did not get used often enough to be smooth, and it was, I understood even then, an entirely different sound from the one that Hall produced on command. It came late. It came unevenly. It did not arrive at the exact instant the sentence ended. It arrived a half-breath after, the way real laughter always does, once you have learnt to listen for the gap. "I do not think I have laughed at a dog in 4 years," he said, when he had finished. "I want you to know that I am aware of how strange that sentence is, and I am saying it anyway." I came back the next week, with more of Ronja's letters, on purpose, because I had understood by then that this was not idle kindness on my part. It had become the 1 hour of his week in which nothing at all was required of him except to listen to something small and true, and I had started, without quite admitting it to myself, arranging my whole week around being able to give him that. "You could simply ask them to stop," I said once, being an idiot, because I had not yet understood the size of what I was standing in the middle of. "I have asked them to stop," Axel said. Twice I told the hall, plainly, that I did not require laughter as a courtesy and would prefer honest silence to performed amusement. He looked at his own hands. The very next feast, they laughed exactly as they always had. Instantly together, I do not think they can hear the instruction anymore. I think it has become something the hall does the way a heart beats, and I do not know how you tell a room to stop having a reflex. His wolf started coming to those evenings in the 3rd week, and it had opinions about the whole business that Axel found mortifying. The animal would come in and lie down across the doorway, not near Axel, near me, which the king noted with visible discomfort every single time, and it would watch the 2 of us talk with the fixed patient attention of a creature that had clearly decided something and was waiting for the humans to catch up. Once, when I laughed properly at something Axel said, the wolf's tail went, twice, against the floor, and Axel put his face in one hand and said, "He does that now." Every time. I want it on the record that I have never once encouraged it. I did not know yet that the King of Grimhold had spent 3 years listening to a hall full of people laugh at him on command, and that a single honest laugh had told him something he had not let himself believe. I did not know what it would cost me to be the one person in that hall who kept forgetting to perform. If you want to find out what 40 ranked lords were actually doing every time they laughed together, stay with me. What I found in the steward's office in the 5th week is the reason none of this stayed a small, strange story about a joke. I found the ledger by accident, the way I have found most of the important things in my life. I was in the steward's outer office in the 5th week, waiting to deliver a message, and there was a book open on the clerk's desk that I was not meant to be reading and read anyway, because it is not in my nature to leave an open page alone. It was a tally. Dates down one side, names across the top, and a small mark in each box, a single stroke, entered in a fine, careful clerk's hand, at every formal feast for the past year. I did not understand what I was looking at until I found the column headed Laughter. General and understood that somebody had been recording, feast by feast, exactly which lords laughed and which did not. I asked the clerk, carefully, what the book was for, and he told me without any suspicion at all, because he had no reason to think a tray girl asking about ledgers was dangerous. Lord Kessler's own record, he said. Attendance and disposition, he calls it. He likes to know the temper of the hall. I did not think much of it that day. I want to be honest about that. I thought it was strange and slightly unpleasant, the way a great many things about a great house are strange and slightly unpleasant, and I went back to my tray and did not think of it again for 2 weeks. I thought of it again, because of the grain tax. There was a council vote coming. I knew this the way anyone in that keep knew anything, which is by carrying trays past open doors on a new levy on the grain coming through the eastern mills, and I had heard, in the kitchens, in the way you hear things below stairs, that the mill towns were furious about it, that there had been near riots in 2 of them, that the harvest had been thin, and the levy would be thinner still. And at the feast 3 nights before the vote, King Axel made a joke, a genuinely good one this time, about a councillor's new hat, and the whole hall laughed, instantly, together, exactly as it always did, and I stood at the foot of the table with my tray and did the arithmetic without meaning to. A territory on the edge of a grain riot does not sound, in that hall, any different from a territory at peace. Something in me went very still and very clear. I went back to that ledger that same week, properly this time, with an hour instead of a glance, and I did what I am apparently built to do, which is read a thing all the way through instead of only the part I was meant to see. 44 of the 61 recorded feasts fell within 3 days of a council vote, not evenly spread across the year, clustered, deliberately, around exactly the moments when the king's disposition toward his own lords would matter most. And beside each name, alongside the laughter mark, was a second column I had missed the first time, a rating. A number, 1 to 5, in Kessler's own hand, headed simply reliable. It was not a record of amusement. It was a scorecard of who could be trusted to perform contentment on command. Updated feast by feast and cross-referenced, I would learn over the following days, against every vote those same lords cast in council. The lords who laughed hardest voted with Kessler most often. The lords who laughed least had, over the past year, one by one, stopped being invited to the formal table at all. He had not silenced dissent. That would have been clumsy, and Kessler was never clumsy. He had simply built, over years, a room in which dissent could not be heard, because every reaction in it had been trained and rated and rewarded into a single performed note. And a king who cannot hear a genuine laugh cannot hear a genuine objection either, because they travel on the same instrument. And Kessler had spent years quietly tuning that instrument until it played nothing but agreement. The grain levy was Kessler's own. That was the last piece, and it took me another week to find it. Buried in a trade account, 3 ledgers deep, a private contract, in Kessler's own household name, for the milling and transport of crown grain at a margin that the new levy would triple. He was not merely managing the king's mood before the vote. He was profiting from the exact policy the mood management existed to smooth the passage of, and he had built a hall that could not tell the king his own people were close to starving, because starving people do not laugh on cue, and a lord who reported it honestly had, over a year, quietly stopped receiving invitations. I did not know how to tell Axel any of this without it sounding like exactly the kind of thing a jealous or ambitious servant might invent, and I sat with that for 2 days before I understood that the only proof that would hold was the ledger itself, in Kessler's own hand, which could not be argued away as my imagination. I took it to Bjark first, because I trusted his face more than I trusted my own courage. He went very quiet reading it, the way I had, and then he said the thing I needed to hear, which was, "This explains 4 other things I have wondered about for a year and never had the wit to put together." We went to Axel together, that night, and I watched a king read a scorecard of his own hall's laughter, feast by feast, vote by vote, and understood, watching his face, that this was worse for him than any of the loneliness had been. Because the loneliness, at least, he had assumed was simply the nature of his position. This was proof that it had been built. "He has been managing me," Axel said, very quietly, with my own dinner table. He read it twice through, cover to cover, and on the second pass he stopped at a name near the middle of the list and went very still. "Lord Farron," he said. He stopped attending the formal table in the spring. I asked Kessler about it once and was told he had taken ill. He turned the page back. His mark stops in the 3rd month. Every entry before that, low, A2, most weeks, never higher than a 3. He wasn't performing well enough, Bjark said quietly. So he stopped being invited, and it was dressed up as illness, and nobody thought to ask a sick man whether he was actually sick. Axel closed the ledger very carefully, the way you close something you are afraid of tearing. "I want him found," he said. "Tonight I do not care what hour it is." Farron was not ill. He was 3 days' ride south, on his own modest holding, having been quietly, courteously, and entirely, without explanation, removed from every list that mattered at Grimhold for the crime of once, at a formal table, failing to laugh at something that was not funny. He came back inside the week, and he was the second witness we needed, because a man who has lived a year believing his own honesty cost him his king's regard has a great deal to say once somebody finally asks him to say it. Kessler moved the moment he understood the ledger was missing, because a man who has kept a scorecard for a year notices within a day when it stops appearing on his clerk's desk. His first move was not against me directly. It was against the vote itself. He tried to have it moved forward, quietly, before anyone could raise a question in council, using precisely the tool he had always used, which was a feast. He called a formal table 2 nights early, an unscheduled one, on the excuse of a minor diplomatic courtesy, and I understood immediately what it was for. One more performance, one more room full of laughter timed exactly right, to settle the king's nerves before a vote Kessler needed passed. I stood at the foot of that table, with the ledger rolled inside my apron, and I watched 40 lords laugh together, instantly, at a joke that was not especially funny, and I watched King Axel's face do something I had never seen it do before, which was to actually listen to the sound and hear, for the first time, exactly what it was. He did not wait for the wine to be cleared. "Enough," he said, and the hall went quiet in an entirely different way than it had gone quiet for me. I would like every lord at this table to tell me, honestly, whether you found that joke funny. Not whether you laughed, whether you found it funny. Nobody answered. 40 ranked people, and not one of them could produce, on demand, the thing they had all just performed together a moment before. I stood at the foot of the king's own table with a ledger in my hands instead of a tray. 61, I said. 61 recorded instances of laughter at this table in the last year. My lords, every one of them entered by Lord Kessler's own clerk, with a mark beside each name for who laughed and who did not. I turned a page, and 44 of the 61 fall within 3 days of a council vote. I would like this hall to explain to me why the king's own jokes are funniest in the week before his lords are asked to agree with him. Kessler did not run, because there was nowhere in that hall to run to, and because a man who has spent years being careful does not lose his composure in a single evening, even when everything he has built comes apart in front of him. A record of hospitality, he said, with real and terrible calm. A steward tracks the temper of a hall the way he tracks the wine. There is no crime in noting who is pleased. There's a second column, my lord, I said. Reliable. And a third book, in your own trade name, for the milling contract that this levy would triple. I would like this hall to hear you explain those together, because I could not find a way to read them apart. That was the thing that finished him. In the end, and it was not the ledger of laughter, a room full of ranked lords can be argued into believing a scorecard is simply careful stewardship, right up until it sits beside a private contract that profits directly from the policy the scorecard was smoothing the way for. Once those two books were read together, out loud by a tray girl standing where trays are meant to stand, there was no version of careful stewardship left that anyone in that hall was willing to say out loud. He confessed nothing, of course, and there was, in the strict sense, no single crime that could not be argued. A contract signed honestly, a ledger kept diligently, a levy proposed on its own apparent merits. What took him was the accounting that followed, months of it, tracing the milling contract back through 3 intermediaries to his own household seal. And once that was laid beside a year of feasts timed to votes, the council did not need him to confess to anything at all. The levy was withdrawn. The mill towns got their thin harvest counted honestly instead of taxed on a lie, and it cost the crown a great deal that season, and Axel has never once told me he regretted it. Here is the cost, because there was one, and I will not pretend otherwise. The formal table changed entirely, and not gently. Axel ended the twice-monthly feast in its old form within the month. Smaller gatherings now, fewer places, no clerk with a ledger anywhere near the room, and half the ranked houses of Grimhold have spent 2 years quietly furious about the loss of an institution they had built their whole social year around, whatever it had actually been for. I am, in certain circles, still known as the servant who ended the feasts, said with exactly the weight you would expect. And I lost the thing that started it, which is a strange loss to name, but I will name it anyway. I do not laugh at Axel's jokes freely anymore, not the way I did in that first month, because now every laugh I give him is a thing he half wonders whether he can trust completely. And I half wonder it myself, and neither of us has ever said so out loud until now. We are working at getting that back. It is slower than anything else in this account. Axel asked me in the winter, in that same small room off the council chamber, with no table between us, exactly as the first time. I am not going to make a joke, he said. I have thought about it, and I could not find one that did not feel like testing you, and I am finished testing anyone in this keep for the rest of my life. He looked at me plainly. You are the only person who has been honest with me in this hall in longer than I can measure, and I do not want a wife who has learnt to perform contentment. I would rather have your honest silence for the rest of my life than one more performed laugh, and I am asking you because I would like to find out, slowly, over the rest of both our lives, what is actually funny to you. That's a very serious way to ask a woman to marry you. "I am told I have lost the knack for the other kind," said the King of Grimhold. "And I find I am not sorry about it." I laughed at that, properly, and I watched his whole face change at the sound of it, and I kissed him first, in that small room, with no table and no ledger, and no hall full of 40 people between us. It was brief, and it was warm, and it settled something in me that had been braced since I was 17, and learnt that the safest thing a servant can be is unnoticed. 2 years on, the formal table is small and strange and, according to half the old houses, considerably less dignified than it used to be. I still work in that hall, though not with a tray. I sit at Axel's left most nights now, and I have made it my particular business to say plainly when something is not funny, because a king who has been lied to by laughter for years needs at least one person in the room whose silence he can trust as much as her laugh. Bjarki keeps his own ledger now, openly, on the council's order, not of laughter, but of dissent, a formal record that any lord's objection to any policy must be entered in writing and read aloud before a vote, so that no honest voice can simply stop being invited. It has made council meetings considerably longer and considerably more honest, and Bjarka complains about the length constantly and has never once suggested changing it back. The wolf still comes to every evening we spend in that small room and still lies across the doorway nearest me, and Axel has given up entirely on pretending he minds. I still wonder about the other lords, honestly, more than I wonder about Kessler. Kessler built the room because it profited him, and there is no mystery in a man like that. But 40 ranked people laughed together, instantly, for a year, at things that were not always funny, and most of them were not being paid to do it. They had simply learned, the way you learn any survival, that laughing on cue was safer than risking silence in a room where silence got you quietly uninvited. Tell me in the comments whether you think that makes them complicit or simply frightened, because I have never been able to decide, and I was 3 feet from that table for 2 years before I understood I was standing in the middle of it too. Comment the ledger if you want to hear what Axel's wolf did the first time Lord Kessler tried to return to that hall for a formal apology. And if you want more nights like this one, a king who could not tell his own jokes from silence anymore, a hall that had learnt to laugh on command, and one honest sound that gave the whole performance away, stay close. There is more of Grimhold left to tell. Where are you listening from tonight? I would love to know.